Hey everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session of Purple Hats today. It's my great pleasure to have my friend and colleague Christopher Friends here joining us. Hey Christopher,
Hello,
and where are you today, sir?
I'm based out of New York.
That's great. And I'm joining you from Oakland, California. Christopher is the AVP for Information Security at Mount Sinai South Nassau, and he is a thought leader in threat informed defense and cybersecurity. And in addition to being our customer, he really came to my attention when he wrote this great article on the practice of threat informed defense and MITRE ATT&CK. What was it, 2 years ago, Christopher? When was that?
About that, yes.
Yeah. And he then approached me about the idea of writing a book about evidence based cybersecurity. And we're super excited. It's almost done. We've been working on it forever. Well, not forever, for a year or so, and it will be published soon. And he's going to preview some of the findings that he has from that book here today in this session as a part of our call for papers session. So it's really awesome that he did this. Thank you, Christopher, for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so you'll talk for just a few minutes, and then I'll ask you some questions. So over to you.
Sure. Today we're going to talk about seeing through the security illusion. One of the things as security professionals that should really concern us is we're starting to see a disturbing paradox in which cybersecurity spending is at an all-time high, but yet we still see constantly increasing ransomware attacks. We see constant increase in data breaches. We don't see what we would expect where all this increased spending will lead to a decrease in these events. They're still increasing despite this increased spending. And as security professionals, this should really get us asking a question of what might we be doing as an industry that's wrong? Because obviously something is not working out correctly. And one of the reasons I think this is a lot of times organizations go ahead, they invest in these tools, they deploy these tools, but a lot of times the out of the box protections don't work as well as organizations think. We'll often see that if we deploy a set of controls or a particular tool, it might only catch about half of the TTPs or other attack vectors that it needs to. And a lot of what we need to detect actually goes undetected. And this doesn't even take into account advanced obfuscation techniques or other product specific bypasses that can make these detection rates even worse. So, one of the issues I think is that all too often companies find that they have the illusion of security in place after they go ahead and deploy all of these tools, but they don't actually have the level of security in place that they think they have. And I think this is further compounded by the fact that a lot of security today is very compliance based. And many organizations are concerned with compliance, but they meet the goals of compliance and then stop there. And compliance, in my opinion, should be viewed as a minimum benchmark, not the end goal. I think you can easily be compliant and still be insecure. The way I see it is that compliance is kind of like trying for a D grade in the class. Yes, you check all the boxes, you might pass because you check all the boxes, but it doesn't mean you're doing a good job. And I think the real problem with these compliance based approaches and relying solely on compliance is that most compliance approaches check for the existence of a control, but they don't consider the efficacy of the control at all. So, for example, you may get credit for having a firewall in place, but it doesn't mean you have all the proper policies for egress filtering or other controls within the presence of the firewall. And that's one of the issues where a lot of these compliance based frameworks fall short. So what I think as an industry we need to begin to do is to move away from just these pure compliance-based frameworks and to start to shift away from this illusion of security by adopting more of an evidence-based approach to security.
Christopher, I just have a quick question for you on this. As we think about how much time security teams spend on compliance, could you walk the audience through the amount of effort and time that it takes to select a compliance framework and then administer it and then go about the audit process using it?
I think it's definitely time consuming, and I don't think the evidence based methods are going to completely replace compliance based frameworks today. I think compliance is not without value. I think the major problem is that organizations often view it as the end goal, and once they achieve compliance with the framework, they stop. And I think that's where the real problem comes in. I think compliance frameworks can often give a false sense of security because just because you meet all the standards of a compliance framework does not necessarily mean that you are necessarily secure. If we take a look at PCI DSS, for example, for years, WEP as a protocol was compliant under the PCI DSS framework, even though it was well known that WEP had all kinds of security flaws and that WPA was a better solution. Now, there's various reasons why WEP was accepted for so many years after it was found to be insecure. but it does highlight that there's a clear discrepancy between compliance and security in a lot of cases. And I think that's the trap a lot of organizations fall into.
Great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I think as cybersecurity professionals, we need to start developing quantitative methods for empirically evaluating security controls. We need to stop assuming that the controls that we deploy work and actually take the time to test them and ensure they're effective against mitigating the various tactics and techniques that we'd see as part of a cyber attack. Moreover, I think we need to develop metrics around these security controls to ensure that changes we make to our environment actually result in improved security outcomes. It's really time for us as an industry to make security much more of a science than the art form it's viewed as today. So, as part of adopting a more evidence based approach to security, I like to follow the following evidence based framework. I like to do a quantitative risk assessment to identify the threats that are relevant to my organization. I like to develop metrics that I can use to quantify the threat, the impact the threat would have on the organization, the efficacy of the controls I have in place, as well as the efficacy of my incident response process. Once that occurs, I like to develop a way to simulate the threat, whether it's through using a breach and attack simulation platform, using pen testing tools, or other methods, but develop a way to simulate the threat within my environment so I can then go and simulate the threat and measure the efficacy of my controls using the metrics I just developed. Once that occurs, I like to take the time to then look at the findings, analyze what we did right, what we did wrong, see what can be improved, and use that as a basis for developing a remediation plan. And then what's most key, in my opinion, is then going back and repeating those tests again to say, did the change I made now stop the attack that I couldn't previously stop? And by doing that, you're actually beginning to measure the efficacy of your controls within your environment and actually quantitatively demonstrating that the changes you make to your environment are actually improving security.
How much of an improvement do you see? If you go back to the last slide for just a second, how much of an improvement do you see when you get to the last step? This is very helpful circle. I think this is a great process for folks to adopt. But how much improvement do you see after you do the analysis, the remediation, and then you start the process again? What's the sort of percentage average that you're aiming to see from an improvement standpoint?
I think it really depends on the type of control and how mature your program is. Because one of the things is as you get more and more mature in your control framework, you may
Mhm.
see that you get less of an improvement in terms of a percentage. But I think that's part of where the risk assessment comes in initially, is you want to identify the areas where your organization is likely weakest, and apply that this type of methodology to that first, because that's where you're going to get the biggest increase. It's not so much, I think, in terms of starting this, you don't want to necessarily just test what you're strong at so you get really good numbers. Oh, we blocked, 90% or whatever it happens to be. I think you're much better off, rather than attempting initially to make the strong stronger, looking at the areas where you think you're actually weak in, where you think your security is going to be poor, and starting in those areas because that's where you're going to get the biggest security increase. And that's going to be a little different for every organization. But overall, I think identifying where you're weak in, doing that risk assessment, saying I'm most likely to see these attacks, and beginning in those areas is where you're going to get the most value out of doing something like this.
And that's great. How do you start when you start the quantitative assessment to identify the threats that matter most to you? What do you lean on when you think about that threat analysis?
I like to look at attacks that other organizations within the same industry are seeing. So, for example, in
Mhm.
healthcare, ransomware is definitely a big one. So, the various tactics and techniques that different ransomware actors use is definitely of interest. One of the other things I like to do is you actually look at various threat groups and see if there's any tactics and techniques that they are common to them. Because if
Mhm.
you have a lot of common techniques, those might be the ones worth focusing on most because you're most likely to see them since, let's say, 5 different threat actors use them rather than just a single one. And those might be higher return techniques. So one of the things I like to do is to map out the various techniques that these groups like to use that are likely to target me and really focus on the ones that are common to a lot of the attack groups. The other thing I really like to do is to look at a lot of the attack flows, similar to Attack IQ puts out, where they actually go through the entire flow that an attacker might follow. And one of the great things about that is it illustrates some steps where if this particular technique does not succeed, the attack flow can't continue and you can shut the attack down. And for me, those are good TTPs to target as well, because they're higher impact in terms of interrupting an attack.
Are you a part of the healthcare ISAC, or are there other threat streams that you contribute or to, that you receive information from, rather?
We are definitely part of the HISAC, and we can receive data from a lot of other sources as well. I do like to receive data from multiple sources and try to correlate it, see what the trends are in terms of what threats we're likely to face.
Hmm. That's great. Thank you.
One of the illustrations of why I think this framework is great goes back to actually one of my first experiences doing an evidence based approach to security. Back in 2015, the hospital I worked for at the time became really interested in malware and what it could do to the network, wanted to see what the impacts would be. So we actually decided to take the time to simulate a malware outbreak within the hospital. And one of the things we did is we made use of the ICAR test file, which, for anybody unfamiliar with it, it's that weird string of characters on the slide. And it's a harmless file, but years and years ago, all the AV makers got together and agreed to treat it as a virus. So it kind of provides a safe but effective way to simulate malware in the environment. And we decided to write a script that attempted to copy this particular file to all the PCs in the organization to test various controls we had in place. And doing this exercise and simulating this attack, we learned a lot of really interesting things. But one of the things I really want to focus on was going back to that point about compliance and the illusion of security. So one of the things that we had in place is we had a segmented network in place at the hospital. And by 2015 standards, the segmentation we had in place exceeded any compliance standard at the time. It was better than what the majority of hospitals had. And one of the interesting things we found with this test is that our segmentation actually worked really well. It did keep the threat contained. But by doing this exercise, we learned that even though we were able to keep the threat contained, the efficacy that we needed was not there. So it was control. It was actually a working control, not even a control that failed. But the simulated attack clearly illustrated that the control was not granular enough to actually meet our needs. So at the time, we had segmentation by department, and if we were to lose an entire emergency room or an entire radiology department, it was still going to be disastrous to operations for the organization. So doing this kind of exercise was very, very eye-opening, and this was kind of my first approach, take my first evidence-based security, I guess, approach. This is how I kind of got into using this methodology. So it was really, really eye-opening, and ever since then, I've really been big on doing this type of approach to security because when you actually put the controls to the test and see when they'll work, when they won't work, it's really eye-opening, and it really does show how a lot of security is often an illusion unless you can actually validate that it works.
So you talk about how the fact that despite the success of keeping the threat contained, the necessary level of control efficacy wasn't present. Can you talk a little bit about the discrepancy between the containment and what you were looking for from a control, and how you measured it exactly? And then from that, like, I have a follow-on question after that. So go answer that one first.
Sure. So one of the things that at the time we had ACLs and switches basically, and those ACLs prevented different departments from their network traffic from talking to each other. So if we were to run this simulation and let's say we launched this in our radiology department, the entire attack was going pretty much contained to the radiology department. And we validated and verified that worked well. The problem is if we were to lose an entire critical department like that, it was going to impact patient care still. So while the control worked, it clearly learned that it wasn't granular enough because if we were to lose all those computers, that was going to be disastrous to our operations. So based on this, we actually took an approach of adopting zero trust. And by 2017, at the time, we were actually the first healthcare organization in the country to have a zero trust network. And that was all brought about by actually doing these tests because it clearly illustrated that even though we exceeded any kind of security standard at the time, it was nowhere near sufficient to actually meet our needs in the face of a real world attack.
So how long did it take to adopt the zero trust strategy, and what was required in that process?
That was about a 2-year process at the time. So we kicked it off in 2015 after doing this test. It was about 2017 before we could really consider it more of a zero trust network. We approached it a couple of different ways at the time. For the data center, we used a product called the NSX. And on the more physical network side, we largely did it through a NAC solution. So one of the things we did is we made it so the PCs within the organization couldn't talk to each other. They could only talk to our server subnets, which were microsegmented by the NSX product. So we basically used the two solutions together, where the NAC limited the traffic to the server subnet, and the microsegmentation policies in NXX made sure that any individual device could only talk to the handful of servers it needed to, and not everything. And at the time, that was the approach that we took. Since doing that, there's a lot of other tools, a lot of other options available. But at back at that hospital, that was the approach we took. And how we approached it was we did the simple low hanging fruit systems first. We did things like our DHCP and DNS servers because the network team all understood the ports and protocols, so it made it really easy to do. We did things like workstations next because with one policy you could protect a large part of your environment. Then we kind of did higher risk systems, and then we kind of saved what we considered low risk and complex for last.
Wow, that's really cool. And did you ever do any testing of your zero trust networks after you installed them in a way that would validate the controls?
We did, and actually, I have a more interesting story with the current hospital I'm at, where we have also pursued a zero trust initiative. Slightly different architecture, different tools, because different architectures suit different organizations. But it's one of the interesting things we actually did from doing some breach and attack simulations is in our initial zero trust rollout. One of the things we didn't think to lock down was ping. We figured because ping is so useful for troubleshooting, we were going to exempt ping from a lot of the policies we had keeping different systems from talking to each other. And then we did a lot of the breach and attack simulations, and some of the simulations we ran that were critical for us involved attackers using things like ICMP tunneling, where they were leveraging ping as part of their attack plan. So one of the things we did as a result of the breach and attack simulation in this area was we actually, in our zero trust product, which is a product called Guardicore, we created some identity-based policies to allow people in IT to leverage the ping protocol, but we took it away from the average doctor or nurse who doesn't have a need to use it. And that was one of our ways of mitigating that particular risk that our zero trust policies didn't account for, and was discovered through testing that we did.
That's so cool. That's really cool. I love it. Okay, thanks for stopping here. But let's. I don't want to keep you too much. The next slide.
Sure. So the other thing I think that this approach really lends itself to is better metrics. I think one of the reasons that security today is also not as scientific as it needs to be is I think a lot of the metrics we use in security are vanity metrics. We've all seen things like presentations, like my spam filter blocked 100 messages today, or 1,000 messages today, whatever the number happens to be. That might sound nice, it might sound impressive, but it's really not actionable in any way. Is that good? Is that bad? There's really no context to help us with that. And I think a lot of the metrics that we as industry use today kind of fall into that category. There are a lot of metrics too that I think are non-vanity. Like I do believe there's a value in traditional metrics like KPIs and KRIs. I think they're very useful. But one of the shortcomings I think of a lot of the traditional KPIs and KRIs we use today is that they don't have the needed level of granularity. So one of the examples I like to give is a lot of organizations are very concerned with mean time to detection. And I agree, mean time to detection, it's worth tracking. It's a worthy goal to improve your mean time to detection. But most of the time, tracking mean time to detection tells the organization that they don't really do a great job at detecting stuff. Their mean time to detection is poor and could be improved upon, but there's no context there to explain how it could be improved upon. And I think the more granular approach of looking at individual attacker TTPs and testing them is a lot more eye-opening and can lead to a much bigger improvement, because then you can suddenly discover that, hey, my mean time to detection is bad because I didn't detect these 10 TTPs that I needed to. So if I now go ahead and build detections or other controls around these, I can have the granularity I need to make that mean time to detection much better. And I think the increasingly evidence-based approaches to security lend themselves to much better metrics and better ways of identifying how we need to improve as an organization or as an industry. I think it's also important too when taking these approaches that there's time taken to embrace imperfection. I think one of the things that a lot of security people is they want the good review all the time. So they want the audit report or wherever else to show they're doing a good job. And I get the drive for that, but I think a lot of times in our industry, more value comes out of identifying the things that we're bad at than reaffirming the stuff that we're good at. And I think it's time as an industry that we accept that no control is perfect and that every tool and every control we deploy is going to have weaknesses. So I think it's really important that we begin to take the time to identify the weaknesses in the various tools and the various controls we deploy so we can put compensating controls in around them to account for these weaknesses. Examples like, my EDR doesn't detect PowerShell 2 fallback. So maybe we should consider disabling PowerShell 2 as a compensating control. Or my EDR doesn't detect threats in CPL files, which is a common way to bypass a lot of modern EDRs. So maybe we add compensating controls by blocking CPL files at the email gateway or from being downloaded, as ways to compensate for our inability to detect if it's executed. And I think the increased evidence based approaches allow us to identify these kinds of imperfections, and we can really use that as a way to drive our security posture forward. And I think it's also great too for empirically demonstrating that we're making improvements to the organization. Because if we execute a breach and attack simulation or other simulation of these TTPs, we can show how prior to taking this action, we blocked 50% of the TTPs we needed to. After we made this change to our control set, we're now blocking 75, whatever the improved number is. So it provides a way to quantitatively show others that there actually is a return on the investment you're making in security and that the security team is headed in the right direction. It's not a matter of just taking my word for it. You can actually start to provide evidence that you're moving the organization in the right direction.
That's great, Christopher. I think one of the things, we came out with this EDR failure report about 6 months ago that found that against the top 7 techniques, EDR controls, that the majority of the EDR controls were only stopping these top 7 techniques 39% of the time, which is obviously too low. And if you look at these techniques that we selected, it was things that would be used in the operations in Ukraine and be used on repeat over and over again by various adversaries around the world that were having significant impact in the real world. And so what I see you doing here is you're saying, I'm going to run these tests, measure my performance, then I'm going to look at what are the things that if I have PowerShell 2, it may degrade my business operations a little bit if I'm using it for some other purpose. But by removing it, I'm going to keep the attack from being able to succeed. I think that's a really important point because what you're getting at here is the process of continuous improvement. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the percentage improvement that you've seen through this process around, say, EDRs or another tool for what is the kind of percentage high level of performance that you're aiming to get to?
It's a good question, and I agree. Out of the box, a lot of these tools don't detect as much as you think they would or should. But at the same time, they could also be leveraged very powerfully to correct a lot of those gaps if you take the time to create a lot of custom detections. So, for example, one of the things that, let's say, a lot of EDR tools won't detect out of the box is things like Active Directory administration tools, tools like AD Find or AD Explorer. And there are good reasons that they won't detect them out of the box because those are tools that a lot of people in IT who had valid administrative functions may have a legitimate use to use. But one of the things that we've done in our environment is we've created different policy sets within our EDR software. So, for example, a doctor or nurse never has the need to run one of those tools. It should be pretty alarming if a doctor is suddenly running AD Find on the environment because that's definitely not part of his job description. Less so if it's somebody on the IT team who manages AD. So one of the things we did is we created various policies to kind of lock down the behavior of a lot of these things to just the people's job roles. So if the person in IT who needs a tool like that, yes, he can launch it, but it's blocked on the average desktop used by a doctor or nurse or somebody in HR or whatever the department happens to be that doesn't have a valid need for those things. So we've run through a lot of the simulations that you're talking about, and we've begun to take away the ability to use a lot of those tools from desktops that don't need access to them. We've done similar for a lot of the living off the land things, like, for example, using the net command to enumerate stuff. Once again, somebody in IT might have the need to do that, but the average desktop probably doesn't. So we began to catalog the behaviors in our environment, and over time, we've created policies to block those behaviors where we can, and where we can't, to limit it to just the approved and documented uses.
This is like the test case scenario in a high risk environment like a hospital where you're dealing with life and death, continuity of care type functions from a mission critical standpoint. you're then going all the way down to the granular levels of using testing to identify what kind of IT capabilities certain folks should have on the basis of their roles. And so this is like access control at a granular level from a threat informed standpoint, and I love it. This is really really helpful. Um, how often do you run these kinds of tests in order to gain the confidence that you feel like you need for managing risk?
We run them quite often. So certain tests we have pre-programmed to run on a scheduled basis because one of the things is you want to repeat certain tests over and over again because misconfigurations and other things can happen over time. So just because we scored, let's say, 100% in the past doesn't mean we don't ever want to do that test again because people make mistakes or things happen where you maybe introduce a new system or something else, and that's going to change things. So we do rerun tests all the time to validate that we continue to provide the level of security that we have in the past. We're also constantly running new tests based on what new threats are. And some of it too is we run new tests as we begin to look at different areas. So, we focused initially heavily on a lot of the workstation controls. As we move into testing other areas of the environment, that involves expanding the scope of testing we do. So there's almost always something new to test and always something that can be made, more granular. It's always a continuing process.
Yeah, I think you've got your last slide, and I know I keep interrupting you with questions, but you're stimulating a lot of thought. So good job.
So the last slide I just want to mention is I think it's really important that attackers pretty much take these evidence-based approaches. So attackers all the time are testing our tools for weaknesses. I've heard a lot of times people quote that your attackers and hackers know our EDRs better than we do, and I think unfortunately there's some truth to that. They spend a lot of time identifying ways in which they can bypass a lot of the security controls we have. So they spend a lot of time focusing on identifying weaknesses within various security deployments, and we on the defense side don't do that as much as we should. So one of the things I think we really need to do is acknowledge that part of the reason why we have that paradoxical trend at the beginning that shows that attackers are exploiting more and more environments even though we're spending more than ever on security is that attackers are using these evidence-based methods to find the weaknesses. And I think one of the things we really need to do as a security industry is begin to use these same methods to take back the upper hand.
That's a beautiful point, Christopher. Um, this is a great, great, great presentation. It's almost like I remember when I first read your article that you wrote on threat informed defense. I thought, have we been paying him secretly? And lo and behold, of course, we haven't, because we just share a vision of the transformative power of threat informed defense. And this is like the level of detail that you've offered through these stories is tremendous. And I think obviously the book will have more in it. But um, can you talk a little bit about we've spent a lot of time so far talking about how you gain control over your infrastructure, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you leverage the data you generate from a reporting and compliance standpoint for auditors, for your board, for your leadership, or any of the regulatory agencies that may have an interest in what you're doing.
Sure. For us, the board was actually very receptive to the approach. And I think even though it's a different way of reporting metrics, they became very receptive to it because it was a way of us quantitatively or empirically demonstrating that what we were doing was actually improving the organization. It's one thing for me to say, like, if we deploy XYZ control, things are going to be better, and they kind of got to take my word for it. It was a whole other matter and gained a lot more support from them and for our security program when I could take, let's say, the RIC playbook and show that, initially we were blocking 70%, and after you gave us this funding and we did XYZ implementation, now we're blocking 95%. And I think it really helped gain a lot of support from the board for increasing investment because they could really see that they were getting a return on what they had invested in.
Hmm. And do you ever use the data you generate in the event of a contingency to assure the board of your position one way or the other?
We definitely have, and it's actually been interesting because as we started using this approach after a few months of doing this and presenting some of the simulations and stuff we were doing in various board presentations, if a new threat appeared, we'd often get called and can you run this and see if we'll be defended against it. So it actually helped increase board engagement too because once they knew we had the capability, every time a new threat appeared, they were curious to see how our controls would stand up, and that was really great for actually increasing board engagement.
That's awesome. And in what ways has it helped you with other regulators or perhaps with insurance companies, if any?
I know there are examples of people it has helped on the insurance side, but that is not something that we have personally experienced yet. But I do think over time the industry is going to go more and more in that direction, where if you can illustrate the control efficacy, that you're more likely to get better premiums than you are if you cannot.
One of the things that we found at Attack IQ, we hired, as you know, and as others may know as well, we hired the analyst firm IDC to interview five of our large enterprise customers. And they discovered business value and savings in the tune of millions and millions of dollars through automated testing. And there was increases in SOC efficiency and staff efficiency, but also things like finding redundant tools within the infrastructure that they could then that they determined they didn't need any longer. And I'm wondering, not to lead the witness too much, but if you've had any of these, or what kinds of experiences you've had in terms of savings and efficiency by adopting an evidence based approach in your multiple roles.
I think it definitely leads to savings improvements across not just this organization, but even my past organization where I did the ransomware simulation. I think these approaches lend themselves very well to improvements in that regard. Because one of the big things is the more you start to lock things down, the less incidents you have. So the less time you spend responding to security issues, and then it becomes kind of a positive feedback loop because the less you're putting out fires, the more you can actually work to further improve security. And the more you do that, it reduces incidents even more, and it's kind of a positive feedback loop really fast. So I think these simulations are a great way to improve that. Also, in terms of detections on the SOC side and everything else, is I think it makes the SOC a lot better because you can actually ensure you have working detections. So one of the big questions is always, what am I missing? What am I not detecting? And this helps to identify what you might be missing, what you're not detecting, and you can begin to create detections around that. So a lot of the work we've done is, we've created various detections to improve things that we weren't detecting prior to that. And it's been really good for that way because we miss far less. You have far less incidents as a result of a lot of the testing because the environment's much more hardened. So I think overall it does lead to a long-term improvement in both the operations as well as the finances for the security department.
And I imagine it would lead to improvements in team health as well, in terms of like wellness of the team if they're chasing less alerts.
It can too, because alert fatigue is a real thing. And if you can make sure your alerts are higher fidelity through testing, it's always a good thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, how would you recommend someone who's not adopted MITRE ATT&CK as a sort of organizing principle for their organization or a breach and attack simulation platform to enable threat informed defense? What recommendations would you give for how to start?
I think there's a lot of ways in which you can start that are very simple. So, for example, the ransomware attack I just talked about earlier, that was back in 2015. Breach and attack simulation platforms really weren't a thing back then. There were some that existed, but they weren't a big thing like they are today. So buying a tool was much less of an option. The iCar test string was a really easy way to test stuff. And there's a lot of other simple stuff you can do too. I mean, some of the commands, like we're talking about enumeration with the net command, those commands can be easily run. They're built into Windows, or things like if you want to test egress filtering, one of the things I like is to do an nmap scan of the site all ports.exposed. And anything that comes back with a positive is a port you're not blocking. So you can have a really simple, we talked about the framework, we developed the metric. The metric could be really simple there. Out of the 65,000 ports, I'm blocking X percent. And you run your test and you identify, let's say, 100 ports that you should be blocking that you're not. You make the change in your firewall, and now you're blocking a higher percentage. So there's lots of really simple ways to apply the framework that don't necessarily require a big upfront investment.
And you've talked about combining zero trust and threat informed defense. This feels like peanut butter and jelly to me, or peanut butter and chocolate, as you know, depending on what your preferences are. But it's like this is so natural, and the federal government's come out with this zero trust strategy. And my argument was like, yes, you need to have zero trust, but you also have to run SolarWinds type emulations against it constantly. And my hope is that like then Congress would ask, say, okay, show us your reporting about how well you've performed against the threats that have affected American society over the last year since you've taken on the zero trust approach. I don't know if that what you think about that.
I think zero trust is a great control. It does have a very high efficacy in keeping threats contained. But one of the things I think a lot of organizations fall short is they expect it to be a silver bullet. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is that defense in depth is still extremely important. So zero trust is a great set of controls, but it's not the only thing that should be focused on. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's just one of the layers that you need to consider.
Chris, it's always so good to talk to you about these issues. You make me smarter. Make other folks that attack IQ smarter, and it is, no pun intended, a deeply validating thing to meet someone who's out there in the world thinking in the exact same that where you are about a problem, and then to have the chance to work with them on it is just fabulous. And as you know, I've loved it, and really appreciate you coming on today. I wanted to. Are there any concluding thoughts? Any wisdom you want to leave with the desperate to learn masses before we conclude the session?
I would say just don't assume it works. Always take the time to validate it, and that'll result in big improvements in your security program.
Yes, yeah. Insert here the quote by Samuel L. Jackson from Pulp Fiction about assumptions, which I won't say because this is a family-friendly channel. So, great point, Christopher. Keep kicking the bad guy's butt. This is great work, and I think you've offered a lot of immense wisdom for folks tuning in. So, thank you again for everything you're doing.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Take care.
Thank you.